Now that we have, or I have, discussed with you the ideas of narrative theory and how they relate to communication and how people see the world, I want to get into more of the nuts and bolts of how does one actually then do criticism. So all of this now is going to be based on the idea that we're storytellers. Actually, Walt Fisher says we are homo narrans. We tell narratives, right? We tell stories. So this method then, if we are ultimately storytellers, the method is about breaking down what's going on in that story. And we have two key, really important terms you need to know here. And the first of them is coherence, the name at the top of this slide. It's coherence. Coherence, sometimes called probability, is this question about, does the narrative hold together? As a person tells you a story, does it just hold up, like just sort of make sense that any of that would happen? So again, the example really is not a rhetorical example, obviously. I apologize for that. But if I ask Eleanor, well, why'd you yell at your brother, I don't like you, and then run to your room and slam the door, right? When she tells me it's because he wouldn't share his Legos with her, I'm like, oh, well, I mean, that sort of holds up. I mean, it's not a great reason to do it necessarily, but it sort of makes sense. And, narratively it does, I guess. And it holds together. As opposed to, she's screaming at him, I don't like you, and ran to her room and slammed the door. And I asked her, well, why'd you do that? If she said, I don't know, I just felt like it. I'd be like, really? Something's going, right? You'd be like, something's going on here, right? Okay. So does the narrative hold together? By the way, we go through that with her sometimes. Why is your brother crying? I don't know. Really? Right. So coherence has to do with, does the outcome make sense given the facts of the narrative? Right. So where the story ends up, as the narrative is being told to us, does it make sense? Right. Does it make sense given what you've told? So given how you've told the story to me, does the outcome of it make sense? And if we wanted to look at the case, for instance, of the shooting of Breonna Taylor. So the story of Breonna Taylor, and as a rhetorical critic, a person could do an analysis of how do various politicians speak about it, right? Or an analysis of how is it reported on in the news, in print news, in television news. How is it being reported on? Those are rhetorical moments and opportunities that we could go and look at. So, as a story of Breonna Taylor, her death, her shooting, say she is shot, she does not shoot. Does the outcome make sense given the facts of the narrative? So, what happened with Breonna Taylor, if you don't know, very quickly, is that the police had they had what's called a no-knock warrant, which meant they could burst into a home. It was actually changed from being no-knock right before, but it's not clear that the police at all followed that. The police were drug enforcement agents. They were plain clothes, so they were not in uniforms. They entered Breonna Taylor's apartment on suspicion that there were drugs in the apartment. There were no drugs in the apartment, based on some intel that apparently didn't hold up. Used a battering ram to break in the door. Breonna Taylor, I believe it was, I don't think it was her partner. I think it was her boyfriend. I don't think it was just a friend hanging out there. I think it was a boyfriend. Thinking somebody's breaking in, hearing the commotion out, the banging on the door, or trying to break in with the battering ram, gets out the gun that is registered to him and fires at the people breaking in, who are plainclothes police officers with a no-knock, who are acting on a no-knock order. One police officer is shot in the leg. The police officers then let loose about 20 rounds of fire, and one of those kills Breonna Taylor, who's in the apartment. So, does the outcome make sense given the facts of the narrative? Well, it's now going to come down to, how do we talk about the narrative in terms of whether or not this makes sense, right? Do the narrative elements fit together believably? So there is a question of whether or not you believe that that sequence of events is even probable. Is it even probable or likely that the police would have such things as a no-knock order, that they'd use a battering ram to knock on the door, that they'd be plain clothes, in plain clothes, that is, plain clothed, that a person hearing somebody breaking down their door who owns a firearm for safety would pull out said firearm and would shoot at them, right? Do all those fit together in a narrative that's believable? Because you may have heard some initial reports saying that the police entered the home and were fired upon, so then they returned fire. And you think, well, I mean, okay, I mean, police walk into a home, they're being fired upon, but why? You might ask, why are they suddenly being fired upon, right? I mean, so it's like, I don't know if I believe that or not, right? That police suddenly walk into a home and they are suddenly being fired upon, like they're just acting on a warrant and they're being fired upon. Like, well, is that story is it fitting together in a way that is believable, right? And so the coherence is asking, are there distortions, inconsistencies, or gaps in the story, right? Things that it doesn't quite again, it's just not probable, it's just not likely that those things would have happened, right? So that's what we're looking for at incoherence. Now recall, I said that rhetorical critics were not journalists investigating whether or not the story somebody's telling is true. But it's a matter of, as the story is being told, does it seem like there's missing elements? And this is something we do when we're sort of doing the math on our scratch paper before we write the answer down on the exam, right? We're looking at these things, whether or not that story is coherent. Right? And we ask the question also whether or not this narrative is going to conflict with another narrative. So the narrative you got is the one I just gave you a second ago, where you say police entered a home with a warrant and were shot at, and they returned fire, and you go, but wait, why were they? Or they shot it? Somebody might say, well, it conflicts with another narrative. The one in which they begin breaking the door with a battering ram, without identifying themselves, and they were plain clothes. You think, oh, well, in that case, I very much understand why somebody would suddenly, with a gun, they keep a gun in their home for protection, would then suddenly fire on said persons breaking into their home, being in plain clothing. Right? You go, okay, wait. So we might talk about how a narrative doesn't have coherence because it conflicts with it. And you think about this just in your personal life. You hear, or even with Reddit, right? In terms of how a story is related to you of what happened in an event, and you think, well, that doesn't sound right because I've heard a different story, right? So there's not the coherence there. So we're talking about coherence. There are 3 types of coherence, and I don't believe your book covers these, as I was reading through it again today. Right. One is a structural coherence. And so structural coherence has to do with the flow of it. Does it seem natural, or well, really the word is probable, that one event follows another like that? It's coherent if you say, yep, that would happen. So people in plain clothing are busting down the door and I have a gun to protect myself. Am I going to fire at them? Yeah, I would have done that. Yeah, okay, yeah, that would happen. Right? So structurally, it follows, right? It follows that sort of thing would happen. Right? So I'm breaking down the door, so somebody gets out a gun to protect themselves. That structurally, that story that follows, right? Characterological coherence, right, as opposed to structural, characterological is about the people. Right? It's about the people. And so if you've ever heard a story, whether it's in the news or maybe in your personal life, and you think, really, but that doesn't sound like them. The question you're raising is one of characterological coherence, right? I can't imagine that person doing that or saying that, right? And so if something has coherence characterologically, you would say, yep, they're like that, right? And so you say, but would police just knock down a door with a battering ram in plain clothes, and not, and scare people in that way to believe their home is being invaded? Well, this is going to go back to what I've already said about the narrative world paradigm. It has to do with, what is your own history? What do you understand about history? What do you believe about the world? That's going to affect how you see these events, right? And so for some people who developed a distrust of police based on a number of events that build distrust in police, things like this and the death of, Eric Garner and George Floyd and so forth, people start saying, oh, right, no, And so to believe, or to find the story probable, to find that story has coherence, you'd have to say, yeah, I think sometimes the police use too much force, right? You would, right, as I told the story to you, right, to follow it, to say that sounds right, right, you would have to also, again, share with me and a belief about how certain people act. Do police act too aggressively sometimes? Now, if you think, no, police don't act too aggressively, they're in dangerous situations, this is how they're acting, is in a reasonable sort of response, then you would find my story is not coherent, right? You see what I'm talking about, right? So you'd be like, no, police don't act that way. Or no, that is how police act. It's going to be based upon the worldview that you already have, whether or not that story makes sense in terms of being likely or probable. And then the material coherence is really, it is narrative comparison, the thing I mentioned on that last slide, right? Like, oh yeah, I've heard that before, right? Uh, and so, as a white person from the middle, and I was raised sort of upper middle class, truthfully, uh, my experience with police has largely just been being pulled over because I was speeding. Right, that's largely been my experience with police. I've not been harassed in other ways as a white man with a certain sort of class status, and by the way, who presents very much as a white man. You've probably seen me, very fair skinned. Um, and so when I hear you tell me the story that the police broke into a home and they start, that they broke into a home and they started shooting, I think, well, I admit, I have to read the story a little bit more because it challenges how I want to think about police. There's sort of that narrative comparison. And also the fact that I have two nephews who are in law enforcement, and one of them actually was a DEA agent, or not DEA. Well, yes, I don't know if he's actually was DEA, or I guess he's on that like a drug task force. And in fact, sometimes they was part of drug bust where you break in the door and that sort of thing. And I want to think of my nephews as being very fine, good people because of how I've known them in my personal life. And they're seeing them since they were born, really. Um, yeah, and so whether or not the story of, police just, busting in like that, or even of the very story, right? So they read the story about with the death of Breonna Taylor. I mean, I had to read more than one account to sort of get other details, be like, okay, well, that sort of makes sense then. I mean, makes sense in that, yeah, right. So they were fired at, but they were fired at because they'd busted down a door. Okay, well, that makes sense, right? And to see how an earlier story said that police entered the home and were fired upon, I was lacking information. So that narrative comparison showed me there was a problem there. When the first story I read said the police entered a home on a warrant and they were fired upon, so that's why they returned fire. They were breaking down the door with a battering ram. The person believed their home was being broken into. The officers were in plain clothes. So that first story doesn't hold up so much or so well anymore, right? Yeah, and so it's about whether or not you've heard a telling of the event that conflicts with it or supports it, or a very similar event that conflicts with or supports it, right? I'm saying right. I'm hoping that makes sense. The other key term here is fidelity. The other key term is fidelity. Does the narrative ring true? As we often say, does it ring true? So not make sense in the sense of like it's probable, which is coherence, but does it ring true? And we say, and I'm going to add in the word here, morally. Does it make sense, or does it support sort of my own values or my morality? And so we want to ask the question, how does the narrative try to resonate with the audience's experiences and beliefs? We're really not going to go around surveying people who were there, gumshoe reporting sort of thing about their, about what was going on with them or who were they in the audience. But it's saying, when a narrative is given to an audience, how does it try to resonate with audiences' experiences and beliefs? What is it trying to get them to accept, to then believe that this story is good and true, right? So how's the narrative try to resonate with the audience's experiences and beliefs? So what is it saying about law and order in this country, the enforcement of law, whether it's done uh, firmly and justly, or whether it's done to excess and with prejudice, right? how does the telling of Breonna Taylor's death, whoever's telling that story, how does it try to resonate with the audience experiences and beliefs? And also, in what ways does the narrative try to reflect the values or goals of the audience? Right. And so, because we get I mean, so it's not that we are saying with any conclusive, or we even want to try to be conclusive about whether or not the audience really bought into it here necessarily, but thinking about the rhetor being, you know, the writer of an article, a speaker, the rhetor, sort of this corporate rhetor as they produce um, a commercial or a film or a television show. In what way does the rhetor then um, tr offer a view of the world that they're hoping will resonate with their audience experiences, right? So if you're going to think that this story rings true, is sort of sounds morally, or aligns with your morals, and not that the thing happened in the story was good, but that who's made out to be villains to you are the villains, who's made out to be heroes to you are the heroes, and who's made out to be the victims to you are the victims, as opposed to another telling the story in which who you think are the victims, somebody else is making the villains. That represents a different morality. So again, these two questions I'm putting here. How does a narrative try to resonate with the audience experiences and beliefs, right? How is it hoping? What is it assuming as it tells a story to be believable? What is it probably assuming are the audience's experiences and beliefs, right? And that second item there, what is it? How does the narrative try to reflect the audience's values? Listen, I mean, all the time you read things, and sometimes you think, yeah, I don't agree with the perspective from which this news story or this broadcaster is speaking or how they're writing. I don't come from that place. You think they're too liberal, you think they're too conservative, whatever, right? But you feel like they're coming from a different place. But you can recognize that they believe in telling the story in a certain way, they're reflecting, right, certain values that you really don't have. I've had the experience before of receiving a mailer, right? So it's a rhetorical artifact, a mailer for a political candidate, and it said, vote for Jones because Jones is going to stop X and Y and start doing Z. And I think, well, actually, I would like us to keep doing X and Y, and I would like to never see Z happen. Right? And I think you did not read me correctly when you sent that. But when I read that, it tells me, they position me in a certain way that it tells me what sort of values they think I have, that they think I would want to stop certain things and start certain things. Right? That's fidelity.